Some hearts close forever after losing everything that mattered. Others just need the right person to show them it's safe to open again. Margaret Waverley thought she knew which kind she had. 5 years of widowhood had taught her that being alone was better than being broken. She ran her ranch with steel in her spine and ice in her veins, her late husband's wedding ring tucked away in a drawer like a relic of foolish dreams. Then she saw Boone Maddox crying by the river. This giant cowboy, who could tame wild horses with nothing but a steady gaze, was kneeling by the water's edge, with tears streaming down his weathered face. Margaret stopped her buggy and stared, her breath catching in her throat. She'd built walls around her heart for good reason, walls that had kept her safe and strong for half a decade. But what happens when those walls meet a man whose gentle tears show her what real strength looks like? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Waverley Ranch as Margaret stood on her wraparound porch, coffee cup in hand, surveying the empire she'd built from grief and determination. 5,000 acres of prime cattle land stretched before her, dotted with prize-winning Herefords and bordered by the meandering Silver Creek that had given Silverbrush Crossing its name. The leather-bound ledger tucked under her arm contained every detail of her operation feed costs, breeding schedules, market price, all written in her precise handwriting. This ledger was more than bookkeeping. It was proof that she needed no one. At 42, Margaret Waverley commanded respect in ways that made grown men straighten their spines and women whisper behind gloved hands. Her dark hair, now touched with premature silver at the temples, was always pulled back in a practical chignon that never wavered, even in the prairie winds. She wore her independence like the finest silk, and it suited her better than any gown ever had. The black mourning dresses had long since been replaced by practical riding skirts and crisp white blouses, but she still wore them like armor against a world that expected her to be fragile. "Morning, Mrs. Waverley." Pete Rodriguez tipped his hat as he approached the porch steps. Her foreman had worked the ranch for 12 years, first under her husband Thomas, and now under her steady hand. Pete was one of the few men in 3 counties who could look her in the eye without flinching, perhaps because he'd seen her tears only once the day they buried Thomas and had never spoken of it since. "The east pasture fence needs mending," she said without looking at him, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "And the bull in pen 3 has been favoring his left hind leg. Have Doc Peterson take a look." "Already sent word to the doc," Pete replied, pulling a worn notebook from his shirt pocket. "That new hand, Boone Maddox, spotted the limp yesterday evening. Good eye for livestock, that one." Margaret's cup paused halfway to her lips. She'd heard the name whispered in Toner Drifter, who'd shown up 3 months ago, looking for work and keeping to himself. The other ranch hands spoke of him with a mixture of respect and wariness, describing a man who could gentle the most spirited horse, but rarely spoke more than necessary to get the job done. "He's been staying in the old bunkhouse at the Garrett place," Pete continued, seemingly unaware of her sudden interest. "Helps out wherever he's needed, never asks for more than fair wages, quiet sort, but reliable." Margaret nodded curtly and turned toward the house. "I'll be in the study reviewing the breeding records. See that the men have what they need." The interior of the Waverley house reflected its mistress, elegant but not ostentatious, comfortable but never soft. Dark wood furniture that had belonged to Thomas's family filled the rooms, each piece heavy with history and expectation. Margaret's study, however, was entirely her own creation. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held volumes on cattle breeding, land management, and legal precedents. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface organized with the precision of a military operation. She settled into the leather chair that had once been Thomas's and opened the ledger, but her mind wandered to the conversation with Pete. Something about the name Boone Maddox stirred a curiosity she thought she'd buried along with her capacity for surprise. In a town where everyone's business was common knowledge, a man who kept to himself was either running from something or protecting something precious. The sound of hooves on gravel drew her attention to the window. Judge Hartwell's carriage rolled up the drive with its usual pompous precision. Margaret suppressed a sigh and closed the ledger. The judge had been a persistent caller since the end of her official mourning period, armed with flowers, compliments, and an increasingly obvious agenda. "Margaret, my dear." Judge Hartwell swept into the study without waiting for invitation, his silver mustache waxed to perfection and his belly straining against his vest buttons. "You look radiant as always. I trust the ranch prospers under your capable hands." "It does." Margaret remained seated, not bothering with the social niceties that might encourage a longer visit. "What brings you out this morning, Judge? Can't a gentleman call on a lady without ulterior motives?" He settled uninvited into the chair across from her desk, his pale blue eyes scanning the room with the air of a man already considering redecorating. "Though I confess, I have been thinking about our conversation last week, about the challenges a woman faces running such a large operation alone." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I face no challenges that competence and determination cannot overcome." Of course, but surely you must feel the burden sometimes, the loneliness of making every decision, bearing every responsibility." His voice took on what he probably imagined was a compassionate tone. "A woman of your quality deserves a partner, someone to share both the joys and the sorrows." "I shared both once," Margaret said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the ledger. "I found that sorrows, when shared, multiply rather than diminish." Thomas had been everything the town expected in a husband: prosperous, well-mannered, ambitious. He'd courted her properly, married her in the white dress her mother had saved for, and given her 5 years of comfortable respectability. What he hadn't given her was understanding. When she'd wanted to learn about the ranch operations, he'd patted her hand and suggested she focus on making their home beautiful. When she'd questioned his business decisions, he'd reminded her that such matters were beyond a woman's concern. When she'd miscarried their only child, he'd been kind but distant, speaking of God's will and future blessings while she grieved alone. It was only after his sudden death from a heart attack that Margaret discovered the depth of his debts and the precarious state of their finances. The beautiful, helpless wife he'd cultivated had been forced to become a shrewd businesswoman overnight, or lose everything. The transformation had been born of necessity, but it had revealed strengths she never knew she possessed. "Thomas was a good man," Judge Hartwell said carefully, "but perhaps not the most practical in his final years. You've worked miracles restoring this place, but surely you're ready for a different kind of life now, a life with less burden and more pleasure." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I find great pleasure in competence, Judge. And I've discovered that the only burden heavier than responsibility is dependence." The judge's face reddened slightly, but he managed a strained smile. "You're too proud for your own good, my dear. Pride is a cold companion, but a reliable one." Margaret moved toward the door, making her dismissal clear. "Good day, Judge." After his carriage disappeared down the drive, Margaret found herself walking through the house with restless energy. The rooms felt simultaneously too large and too small, filled with furniture chosen by a dead man and memories that belonged to someone she used to be. In the bedroom she'd once shared with Thomas, his portrait still hung above the fireplace, stern-faced man with kind eyes and weak chin, frozen forever in his Sunday best. She opened the top drawer of her dresser and pulled out a small velvet box, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the lid. Her wedding ring lay nestled in faded satin, the simple gold band that had once symbolized forever. After Thomas's death, she'd removed it not out of grief but out of honesty. It had never truly fit her anyway. The ring caught the afternoon light as she held it up, examining the inscription inside. "With all my love, T.W." She'd been so young when he'd slipped it onto her finger, so certain that love was about safety and security, about having someone else make the difficult decisions. She'd learned too late that love without understanding was just another kind of loneliness. Margaret closed the box with a decisive snap and returned it to the drawer. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. Evening brought a restlessness that no amount of bookkeeping could cure. Margaret found herself saddling Duchess, her favorite mare, for a ride along the property lines. The ritual soothed her checking fences, counting cattle, reassuring herself that everything remained under her control. The western sky blazed with orange and purple as the sun settled toward the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold that made even the most familiar sights seem touched with magic. She guided Duchess along the well-worn path that followed Silver Creek, listening to the gentle murmur of water over stones and the evening songs of birds settling in for the night. This was her favorite time of day, when the demands of running the ranch gave way to the simple pleasure of being alone with the land she'd fought so hard to keep. As they rounded the bend where the creek formed a natural pool, Duchess suddenly shied, her ears pricked forward in alarm. Margaret's heart lurched as she saw what had spooked the horsey figure kneeling by the water's edge, broad shoulders shaking with unmistakable grief. Time seemed suspended as Margaret stared at the scene before her. The man was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that could carry the weight of the world. His hat lay beside him on the grass, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the collar. His shirt stretched across a back that spoke of years of hard labor, but it was the vulnerability in his posture that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. She should turn around, should give this stranger his privacy and ride home to her safe, controlled world. Instead, she found herself dismounting, her boots silent on the soft earth as she approached the grieving giant by the river. This was how second chances began, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the simple act of choosing compassion over comfort, of staying when everything sensible said to go. Margaret's footsteps made no sound on the soft grass as she approached the kneeling figure. Up close, the man's grief was even more overwhelming. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, and his hands clutched something small against his chest. She could see now that it was a worn leather Bible, its pages softened by countless readings and stained with tears, both old and new. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I didn't mean to intrude." The man's head jerked up, revealing a face that was both ruggedly handsome and utterly devastated. Dark eyes, red-rimmed with tears, met hers, and she saw him struggle to compose himself, to become the stoic figure the world expected. His jaw was strong and square, shadowed with several days' worth of beard, and there was a gentleness in his features that contradicted his imposing size. "Ma'am," his voice was rough, barely above a whisper. He started to rise, but Margaret held up a hand. "Please, don't get up on my account." She settled herself on a fallen log nearby, smoothing her riding skirt around her legs. "Sometimes the best thing about grief is having a moment alone with it." The man stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether her words were genuine or merely polite. Finally, he sank back down, his massive frame seeming to fold in on itself. "You're Mrs. Waverley." "I am. And you're Boone Maddox." She studied his face, noting the way he flinched slightly at the sound of his own name. "My foreman speaks highly of your work. Pete's a good man." Boone's gaze returned to the Bible in his hands, his thumb tracing its worn cover. "Don't know why he'd speak of me at all. Perhaps because you're the first person in 3 months to notice when one of my bulls was favoring a leg." Margaret kept her voice gentle, sensing that this man would bolt like a spooked deer if she pushed too hard. That kind of attention doesn't go unnoticed. A ghost of a smile flickered across Boone's features. "Animals don't lie about their pain. Makes them easier to help than most folks." The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than awkward. Margaret found herself studying the way the dying light played across his features, the way his grief made him seem more human somehow, more real than the stoic cowboys she was accustomed to. "My mother used to read to me from this," Boone said suddenly, holding up the Bible, "every night before bed, no matter how tired she was from working the fields. She had the prettiest voice you ever heard." His voice broke on the last word, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. Margaret felt something inside her chest crack open, a space she'd kept carefully sealed for 5 years. "When did you lose her?" "2 weeks ago." The words came out like a confession. Influenza took her fast. One day she was humming over her mending, the next she was burning up with fever and struggling to breathe. I held her hand when she passed, and she made me promise to keep reading her favorite passages. He opened the Bible to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "But I can't make sense of the words anymore. They just look like marks on paper." "Grief has a way of stealing language from us," Margaret said softly. "After my husband died, I couldn't read anything but ledger books for months. Words about anything but numbers seemed to belong to someone else's life." Boone looked up at her with surprise. "You understand?" "I understand losing someone who shaped your world." Margaret surprised herself with the admission. She'd never spoken so openly about Thomas's death, not even to Pete. "I understand having to learn who you are when the person who defined you is gone. Were you happy with him, your husband?" The question should have been inappropriate, too personal for strangers by a riverbank. Instead, Margaret found herself considering it seriously. "I was content. Thomas was a good man who took care of me in the way he thought best. But happiness?" She shook her head. "I'm not sure I knew what that word really meant when I was married." "My mother was happy," Boone said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about her. "Even when we lost the farm, even when we had to move from place to place looking for work, she found joy in small things. A wild flower by the road, a letter from an old friend, the way the light looked on water." He gestured toward the creek. "She would have loved this spot." "What was her name?" "Sarah Maddox, born Sarah Kellerman in Missouri, but she said she became herself when she married my father." Boone's smile was soft with memory. "She used to say that some people are born knowing who they're meant to be, and others have to be loved into becoming themselves." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd spent 5 years becoming someone harder, stronger, more independent. But listening to Boone speak of his mother's philosophy, she wondered if she'd been moving away from herself rather than toward who she was meant to be. "Tell me about her," Margaret found herself saying. "Tell me what made her happy." For the next hour, as the sun set completely and the first stars appeared overhead, Boone spoke of his mother with a tenderness that transformed him. Margaret learned that Sarah Maddox had collected pressed flowers between the pages of books, that she could make a feast from scraps, that she'd taught her son to see beauty in broken things and possibility in difficult circumstances. "She never remarried after my father died," Boone said, as he carefully returned the Bible to his jacket pocket. "Said she'd had her great love and didn't need another one, but she never stopped believing that everyone deserved to find theirs. Even after I made my mistakes, even when I thought I'd ruined any chance at a decent life, she'd tell me that God wasn't finished with my story yet." "What mistakes?" The question slipped out before Margaret could stop it, and she saw Boone's entire body tense. "Things that don't matter anymore," he said quietly, but his eyes had gone guarded. "Things better left buried with the past." Margaret sensed she'd reached the boundary of what he was willing to share, and she respected it. Everyone had secrets, had moments they wished they could undo. The fact that Boone carried his pain so visibly only made her trust him more, not less. "I should head back," she said, rising from the log and brushing grass from her skirt. "But Boone, your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman, the kind of person who leaves the world better for having been in it." She was. He stood as well, and Margaret was struck again by his sheer size. He could have been intimidating, should have been frightening to a woman alone in the gathering darkness. Instead, she felt safer in his presence than she had in years. "This spot by the river," Margaret said, gesturing toward the peaceful pool. "It's on my land, but it doesn't feel owned by anyone. Feel free to come here when you need to remember her. Sometimes grief needs a proper place to rest." Boone stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. I know you're grieving. I know you loved your mother enough to carry her Bible and honor her memory. I know you're gentle with hurt animals and respectful to women you meet in the dark." Margaret moved toward where Duchess waited patiently. Sometimes that's enough to know about a person. As she mounted her horse, Boone's voice followed her. "Mrs. Waverley, thank you for sitting with me, for not treating my grief like something shameful." Margaret turned in the saddle to look back at him, this giant of a man made vulnerable by love and loss. "Grief isn't shameful, Mr. Maddox. It's just proof that we're capable of loving something more than ourselves." The ride back to the house passed in a blur of stars and scattered thoughts. Margaret found herself replaying every word of their conversation, every expression that had crossed Boone's face. She'd expected to feel uncomfortable about the encounter, awkward about having witnessed such raw emotion from a stranger. Instead, she felt more alive than she had in months. In her bedroom that night, she found herself standing before Thomas's portrait again. His painted eyes seemed to regard her with their usual mild disapproval, as if he could sense her shifting thoughts. For 5 years, she'd kept his memory as a barrier between herself and the world, using his death as justification for her isolation. But tonight, for the first time, she wondered if Thomas would have wanted that. If the man who'd married her for her sweetness and light would have approved of the woman she'd become, competent but cold, successful but alone. Margaret turned the portrait to face the wall and went to bed with Boone Maddox's words echoing in her mind. "Some people are born knowing who they're meant to be, and others have to be loved into becoming themselves." She was beginning to suspect she'd spent 5 years becoming the wrong version of herself entirely. 3 days passed before Margaret found an excuse to return to the river bend. She told herself she was checking the fence line, inspecting the creek for signs of erosion, ensuring that her cattle had adequate access to water. All perfectly legitimate reasons for a ranch owner to survey her property. The fact that her heart raced as she approached the spot where she'd found Boone had nothing to do with her decision. He wasn't there. Margaret tried to ignore the disappointment that settled in her chest as she dismounted and walked to the water's edge. The grass still showed faint impressions where he'd knelt, where she'd sat on the fallen log. She found herself lingering, listening to the gentle murmur of the creek and watching clouds drift across the afternoon sky. "Didn't think you'd come back." Margaret spun around, her hand flying to her throat. Boone stood at the edge of the trees, holding something in his hands that looked like carved wood. He'd cleaned himself up since their last meeting. His beard was trimmed, his clothes were fresh, and there was less rawness in his eyes. But the gentleness remained, the quality that had made her stay, instead of leaving him to his grief. "I told you this place was yours to use," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I meant it. Most folks say things they don't mean. Especially to drifters." Boone moved closer, and Margaret could see what he carried. Small carved horse, no bigger than her palm, rendered in exquisite detail. "But you struck me as different." "What's that you're holding?" Boone looked down at the carving, as if he'd forgotten he held it. "Something I made for my mother. She always loved horses, said they were God's most honest creatures. I finished it the day before she took sick, but never got the chance to give it to her." He held it out to Margaret. "The woods cherry, from a tree that grew beside our old house in Kansas. Thought she'd like having a piece of home to hold." Margaret accepted the carving with careful hands, amazed by the intricate work. The horse seemed to be in motion, its mane flowing, its legs positioned mid-gallop. Every muscle was defined, every detail lovingly crafted. "Boone, this is extraordinary. You made this?" "My father taught me to work with wood before he died, said a man should always have something to do with his hands that brings beauty into the world." Boone's voice was quiet. "Haven't had much call for it in recent years. But grief makes you want to create something, you know, something that wasn't there before." "I don't know," Margaret admitted, running her finger along the horse's carved mane. "I've never been particularly creative. When Thomas died, I threw myself into work, into making sure everything stayed exactly as it was. I never thought about making something new. Maybe that's another kind of creating, keeping something good from falling apart when the world tries to break it down." They settled onto the log together, the carved horse resting in Margaret's palm between them. The silence was comfortable, filled with the sounds of water and wind and the distant lowing of cattle. "Would you read to me?" Boone asked suddenly. "From the Bible, I mean." "I brought it." but the words still won't come together right. Your voice might help them make sense." Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness. "I'm not particularly religious, Boone. I wouldn't want to disappoint you. Religion's got nothing to do with it. My mother used to say the good Lord cared more about kindness than theology anyway." He pulled the worn Bible from his jacket and offered it to her. "Besides, it's not about the words being right. It's about hearing them in a voice that doesn't belong to my grief." Margaret opened the Bible to the page marked with the faded ribbon. The passage was from Ecclesiastes, and she recognized it immediately. "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." She began to read, her voice soft but clear, and she felt Boone relax beside her as the familiar words washed over them both. When she finished, they sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Boone spoke. "She marked that page when my father died, said it helped her remember that even the hard seasons have their purpose." "Do you believe that?" "Some days. Other days I think the seasons just come and go, and we tell ourselves stories about purpose to make the hard ones bearable." Boone turned to look at her. "What do you think?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I think maybe purpose isn't something that exists in the seasons themselves. Maybe it's something we create by how we respond to them. Your mother found purpose in your father's death by raising you with love and strength. I found purpose in Thomas's death by learning to stand on my own. And what season are you in now?" The question caught her off guard. She looked at the carved horse in her hands, at the man beside her, whose grief had called to something she'd kept buried for years. "I'm not sure, but I think it might be time to find out." Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself drawn to the river bend with increasing frequency. Sometimes Boone was there, sometimes he wasn't, but she began to think of it as their placia refuge from the expectations and responsibilities that defined their separate lives. She learned that he'd been working odd jobs around the county, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. He was skilled with horses, gentle with cattle, and could fix almost anything that broke. But there was a restlessness in him, a sense that he was always ready to move on at a moment's notice. "Why don't you settle somewhere?" Margaret asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the water. "You have skills that any ranch owner would value." Boone was quiet for a long time. "Hard to settle when you're not sure you deserve a place to call home." "What makes you think you don't deserve one?" "Things I've done, choices I made when I was younger and desperate." His hands clenched into fists in his lap. "Some mistakes follow you, no matter how far you run." Margaret wanted to press, to understand what haunted this gentle giant, but she sensed that pushing would only drive him away. Instead, she made a decision that surprised her. "I could use help at the ranch," she said carefully. "Pete's been saying we need another hand, especially with calving season coming up. The pay's fair, and there's a bunkhouse that's been empty too long." Boone stared at her with an expression of shock and something that might have been hope. "Mrs. Waverley, Margaret," she interrupted. "If you're going to work for me, you should call me Margaret." "Margaret." He tested her name like he was tasting something sweet. "You don't know what you're offering, what people will say." "People will say I'm a smart businesswoman who recognizes talent when she sees it." Margaret kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "Pete can vouch for your skills, and I can vouch for your character. That should be enough for anyone with sense. And for those without sense?" Margaret smiled, feeling reckless and alive in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "Let them talk. I've never put much stock in the opinions of people who mistake gossip for wisdom." The next morning, Boone Maddox arrived at the Waverley Ranch with all his worldly possessions in a worn saddlebag and the carved horse tucked carefully in his jacket pocket. Margaret watched from her porch as Pete showed him around, noting the way the other ranch hands responded to his quiet competence. By noon, word had spread through Silverbrush Crossing that the untouchable widow had hired the mysterious drifter. Margaret could feel the weight of curious stares when she rode into town for supplies, could see the sideways glances and whispered conversations that followed in her wake. Mrs. Chen, the shopkeeper, was more direct than most. "That's quite a large fellow you've taken on," she said as she wrapped Margaret's purchases. Folks say he's handy with livestock. Folks say correctly, Margaret replied evenly. Course, they also say he's got a past that don't bear looking into too closely. Mrs. Chen's eyes glittered with curiosity. Not that it's any of my business, mind you. No, Margaret agreed pleasantly. It's not. But as she rode home with her parcels, Margaret found herself wondering about Boone's mysterious past. What could he have done that made him feel unworthy of a home? What mistakes haunted him badly enough to keep him moving from place to place like a ghost? She found her answer, at least partially, that evening when she discovered Boone in the barn with a mare that had been acting aggressively toward the other horses. The animal had kicked 2 ranch hands and defied every attempt at handling, earning her a reputation as dangerous and unpredictable. But with Boone, she was gentle as a lamb. He stood beside her, one massive hand resting on her neck, speaking to her in a voice too soft for Margaret to hear the words. The mare's ears were pricked forward, her body relaxed and trusting. "How did you do that?" Margaret asked from the barn doorway. Boone looked up, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. She wasn't mean. She was scared. Someone hurt her badly, and she learned to hurt back before anyone could hurt her again. But if you show her you're not going to harm her, she remembers how to trust. The parallel wasn't lost on Margaret. She moved closer, studying the way Boone's hands moved over the mare's coat, the way the animal leaned into his touch. "Is that how you see me? As something wounded that learned to bite first? I see you as someone strong enough to survive whatever tried to break you." Boone's voice was gentle, "but maybe strong enough to heal too when you're ready." Margaret felt something inside her chest flutter to life, something that had been dormant so long she'd forgotten its name. What if I've forgotten how? Then maybe someone who understands can help you remember. They stood in the golden lamplight of the barn, separated by only a few feet, but connected by something deeper than proximity. Margaret felt the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack, not from force but from the gentle pressure of understanding. For the first time in 5 years, she wondered if she might be ready to remember who she used to be or, perhaps, discover who she was meant to become. Margaret had worn Thomas's pocket watch every day for 5 years. It had been a wedding gift from his father, a symbol of tradition and responsibility that she'd inherited along with everything else when he died. The weight of it in her vest pocket had become so familiar that she hardly noticed it anymore until, the morning she found herself leaving it on her dresser instead of clipping it to her clothing. The change was subtle but significant. Without the constant tick-tick-tick against her ribs, she found herself measuring time differently. Instead of checking the watch every few minutes, she began to notice the way shadows moved across the barn floor, the way the light changed as clouds drifted overhead. Time became less about schedules and more about moments. Boone had been working at the ranch for 2 weeks, and his presence had already transformed the daily rhythm of the place. The other hands, initially wary of the quiet giant, had quickly come to respect his expertise with difficult animals and his willingness to take on the jobs no one else wanted. Pete had confided to Margaret that morale was higher than it had been in months. "That Maddox fellow has a gift," Pete said as they watched Boone work with a young stallion that had been resisting the saddle. "Never seen anything like it. It's as if he speaks their language." Margaret nodded, but her attention was focused on the man himself rather than his skills. There was something almost meditative about the way Boone moved around, horse-slow, deliberate, never hurried or aggressive. He seemed to understand that trust was built in increments, that patience was more powerful than force. "He's been asking about the old cabin by the north pasture," Pete continued. "Wants to know if he could fix it up instead of staying in the bunkhouse. Says he's used to having his own space." The cabin had been empty for years, originally built for a ranch hand who'd wanted privacy for his growing family. After he'd moved on, it had fallen into disrepair, windows broken, roof leaking, porch sagging under the weight of neglect. "Tell him he's welcome to it," Margaret said. "If he's willing to put in the work to make it livable, it's his to use." That evening, she found herself walking toward the cabin as the sun set. She told herself she was simply checking on a piece of her property, but the truth was more complicated. She wanted to see what Boone was planning, wanted to understand why a man who claimed he didn't deserve a home was working so hard to create one. She found him on the cabin's front porch, replacing rotted boards with lumber he must have bought with his own wages. His shirt was off in the heat, and Margaret tried not to stare at the play of muscles across his back as he worked. There was something mesmerizing about watching a man who was truly skilled with his hands, who could take broken things and make them whole again. "You don't waste time," she said, announcing her presence. Boone looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Daylight's too precious to waste. My father used to say that a man who puts off today's work until tomorrow is borrowing against time he might not have." Wise advice. Margaret stepped onto the porch, testing the stability of the new boards. "How long do you think it will take to make it livable?" "A month, maybe 6 weeks if I work evenings and weekends. The bones of the place are good just, need someone to care for it again." Boone gestured toward the interior. "Would you like to see what I'm planning?" The cabin was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a small bedroom, and a loft that could be used for storage. Boone had already begun cleaning and repairing, and Margaret could see his vision taking shape, simple but comfortable, a place that reflected its occupants' preference for function over ornamentation. "I thought I'd put in a proper window here," Boone said, pointing to a wall that faced the mountains. "A man should be able to see beauty when he wakes up in the morning." "And books," Margaret said suddenly. "You'll need shelves for books." Boone smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "You think I'm the reading type? I think you're the type who appreciates good stories, and your mother's Bible will need company." Margaret found herself moving closer, drawn by the warmth in his eyes. "I have more books than I know what to do with. You're welcome to borrow whatever interests you." "That's generous of you." "It's practical. Books are meant to be read, not just collected." Margaret turned in a slow circle, imagining the space as it could be. "This could be quite comfortable when you're finished." "It could be a home," Boone agreed quietly. "First real home I've had since my mother died." Something in his voice made Margaret look at him more closely. "You haven't had a home in all these years? Just temporary places, jobs that moved you along? Hard to put down roots when you're not sure you deserve to stay planted." Boone picked up his hammer, turning it over in his hands. "But maybe I'm tired of running from ghosts." Before Margaret could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves. Through the window, she saw Judge Hartwell riding up the path, his face set in lines of disapproval. Margaret's stomach clenched with dread. "Mrs. Waverley," the judge called as he dismounted. "I was told I might find you here. We need to speak." Margaret stepped onto the porch, positioning herself between the judge and Boone. "What can I do for you, Judge?" "You can explain what you think you're doing, hiring a man like this." Hartwell's pale eyes fixed on Boone with undisguised hostility. "Do you have any idea what kind of talk this is generating in town?" "The kind of talk that reveals more about the speakers than the subject," Margaret replied coolly. "Mr. Maddox is an excellent worker and a decent man. What more should matter?" "What more should matter?" Hartwell's voice rose. "Margaret, this man is a vagrant, a drifter with no references and no history anyone can verify. For all you know, he could be a criminal running from the law." Margaret felt Boone tense behind her, heard the sharp intake of his breath. "That's quite an accusation to make without evidence, Judge." "The evidence is his behavior skulking around, keeping to himself, refusing to answer direct questions about his past. Decent men don't hide their histories, Margaret. They don't avoid honest conversation about where they've been and what they've done." "Perhaps he values privacy over gossip," Margaret said. "Perhaps he judges people by their actions rather than their pedigree." Hartwell's face reddened. "You're being naive, and it's dangerous. A woman alone, isolated out here with a man of questionable character, it's a recipe for disaster. What would people say if something happened to you? They'd say I lived my life making my own choices instead of letting fear and prejudice make them for me." Margaret's voice was steady, but she could feel anger building in her chest. "Now, if you'll excuse us, Judge, Mr. Maddox has work to finish, and I have matters to attend to." But Hartwell wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he probably imagined was a persuasive tone. "Margaret, I've been patient with your independence, your need to prove yourself after Thomas's death, but this is going too far. A woman, in your position, has responsibilities to the community, to propriety, to your late husband's memory. Surely you can see that." The mention of Thomas hit Margaret like a physical blow, but not in the way Hartwell intended. Instead of shame, she felt a surge of clarity. For 5 years, she'd used Thomas's memory as both shield and prison, allowing his death to define what she could and couldn't do with her life. But Thomas had been gone for years now, and she was still here, still breathing, still capable of making choices that were hers alone. "My husband has been dead for 5 years, she said quietly. "His memory doesn't require me to live as if I died with him." "But surely—" "Judge Hartwell." Boone's voice cut through the argument like a blade. He stepped onto the porch beside Margaret, his full height and breadth suddenly, making the older man seem small and fragile. "I appreciate your concern for Mrs. Waverley's well-being, but I think she's made her position clear. Perhaps it's time for you to go." There was nothing threatening in Boone's tone, nothing that could be construed as improper. But there was an unmistakable strength in his presence, a quiet authority that made Hartwell take an involuntary step backward. "This isn't over," the judge said, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "The decent people of this town won't stand by and watch you ruin yourself over some romantic notion about reforming a vagrant." After Hartwell rode away, Margaret and Boone stood in silence on the cabin porch. The confrontation had shaken something loose inside Margaret, a recognition that her growing feelings for Boone were no longer something she could hide or ignore. "I'm sorry," Boone said finally. "I never meant to cause trouble for you." "You didn't cause anything. The judge's opinions are his own responsibility." Margaret turned to face him fully. "But Boone, I need to know, is there truth in what he said? Are you running from something that could hurt you, hurt me?" Boone was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. Finally, he sat down on the porch steps, his elbows resting on his knees. "I made mistakes when I was younger. When my mother was sick, and we didn't have money for medicine, I took something that didn't belong to me. Got caught, spent time in jail. It's been 8 years, but that kind of mark doesn't fade." Margaret felt her heart sink and soar simultaneously. A thief that was the great secret he'd been carrying, the terrible past that made him feel unworthy of a home. "What did you take?" "Medicine from a doctor's office. Broke in at night, took what my mother needed, and left money to pay for it. Not that the law cared about that part." Boone's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "She died anyway, 3 days later, all that guilt and shame for nothing." Margaret sat down beside him on the steps, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "How old were you?" 22. Old enough to know better, too young to know there might have been another way. And you've been punishing yourself for 8 years because you tried to save your mother's life?" Boone looked at her with surprise. "I broke the law, stole from a decent man who was just trying to make a living. You were desperate and grieving and trying to help someone you loved." Margaret reached over and took his hand, feeling calluses that spoke of years of honest work. "Yes, you made a mistake. But the measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes, it's what he does afterward. And you've spent 8 years trying to make amends through honest work and decent living. The law doesn't see it that way. If they find me, if someone recognizes me, I'll go back to prison, and anyone who's helped me will be seen as an accomplice." Margaret squeezed his hand tighter. "Then we'll have to make sure they don't find you." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that changed everything. Margaret had just committed herself to protecting a man she'd known for barely a month, a man whose past could destroy her reputation and her future, and she found that she didn't care. "Margaret," Boone said softly, "you don't understand what you're saying." "I understand perfectly." She turned to face him fully, struck by the vulnerability in his dark eyes. "I understand that you're a good man who made one desperate choice in an impossible situation. I understand that you've more than paid for that choice with years of exile and self-punishment, and I understand that I'm tired of letting fear and propriety dictate my choices." They sat in the gathering twilight, hands linked, both aware that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Margaret felt alive in a way she hadn't experienced since she was young, felt her heart opening to possibilities she'd thought were lost forever. "What happens now?" Boone asked. Margaret smiled, feeling reckless and brave and utterly certain. "Now you finish building your home, and I learn to live again. And we see what comes of two people who've spent too many years being afraid of their own hearts." As they walked back toward the main house, Margaret realized she'd left Thomas's pocket watch on her dresser that morning and hadn't missed it once. Time, it seemed, moved differently when you were brave enough to step into an uncertain future with someone who understood the weight of the past. For the first time in years, she was excited to see what tomorrow might bring. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a postal rider who seemed nervous about his cargo. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as Boone accepted the envelope, noting how his entire body went rigid when he saw the return address. She couldn't make out the details from where she stood, but she could see enough to know that whatever the letter contained, it wasn't good news. Boone tucked the unopened envelope inside his jacket and continued with his morning chores, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept touching the spot where the letter rested against his chest. By noon, she'd made up her mind to ask him about it. She found him in the north pasture, mending fence with an intensity that suggested he was trying to work away whatever troubled him. The mysterious letter peeked out from his jacket pocket, its edges already worn from his nervous handling. "You're going to wear a hole in that envelope if you keep touching it," Margaret said gently, approaching with a basket of food she'd used as an excuse to seek him out. Boone straightened, his hammer suspended in mid-swing. "Didn't hear you coming. You've been distracted all morning. Pete mentioned you nearly walked into a fence post earlier." Margaret set the basket down on a flat stone and studied his face. "Bad news from home?" "Don't have a home to get news from," Boone replied, but his hand moved instinctively to the letter. "This is something else. Something I hoped I'd left behind." Margaret waited, having learned that pushing Boone for information only made him retreat further into himself. Instead, she unpacked the basket, laying out sandwiches and cold lemonade, with the patience of someone who understood that some stories needed their own time to emerge. "My mother had a sister," Boone said suddenly, setting down his tools. "Aunt Lydia, mean as a rattlesnake and twice as poisonous. She never approved of my mother marrying my father, never approved of anything we did. When my mother died, Lydia showed up at the funeral with papers claiming my mother had promised her the farm." "Had she?" Boone shook his head. "My mother left everything to me in a will that was properly witnessed and filed. But Lydia contested it, claimed my mother wasn't in her right mind when she signed it. Said my criminal record proved I was unfit to inherit anything." He pulled the letter from his pocket, staring at the unopened envelope. "I haven't heard from her in 2 years. Thought maybe she'd finally given up. What do you think she wants now?" "Nothing good." Boone's jaw tightened. "Lydia doesn't write letters to say hello or ask how I'm doing. She writes when she wants something or when she's found a new way to make my life difficult." Margaret reached across the space between them and covered his hand with hers. "Whatever it says, we'll deal with it together." The word "we" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither had spoken aloud. Over the past month, they'd grown closer in ways that had nothing to do with employer and employee. Margaret found herself seeking out Boone's company, not because she needed something from him, but because his presence had become necessary to her happiness. She looked forward to their evening conversations by the river, treasured the moments when his rare smile transformed his entire face, felt a warmth in her chest whenever she caught him watching her with those dark, gentle eyes. "Margaret," Boone said softly, "you don't know what you're saying. If people found out about my past, about what I did, it would ruin you, a respectable widow associating with an ex-convict." "I'm 42 years old," Margaret interrupted. "I've survived a husband's death, near bankruptcy, and 5 years of running a ranch that most people said a woman couldn't handle. I think I can survive some gossip." Boone stared at her for a long moment, then carefully opened the letter. As his eyes moved across the page, Margaret watched his face grow pale, saw his hands begin to tremble slightly. "What is it?" "She knows where I am." Boone's voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone told her I was working for you, and she's threatening to come here. To tell everyone about my past unless I sign over my rights to the farm." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Can she do that? Legally, I mean. The farm's been sitting empty for 2 years while the lawyers sort things out. She can't actually take it from me, but she can make my life here impossible if she starts spreading stories about what I did." Boone crumpled the letter in his fist. "I should go. Pack up tonight and be gone by morning. It's not fair to drag you into this mess." "Absolutely not." Margaret's voice was sharper than she'd intended. "You're not running anymore, Boone Maddox. Not from her, not from your past, and not from what's growing between us." The last words slipped out before she could stop them, and she saw Boone's eyes widen with surprise. They'd been dancing around their feelings for weeks, neither willing to be the first to acknowledge what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone around them. "Margaret, don't you dare." "Margaret, me in that tone," she said, standing up and pacing to the fence line. "I've watched you transform this ranch in the past month. I've seen you gentle horses that no one else could handle, fix problems that had been plaguing us for years, and bring a sense of peace to this place that I didn't even know was missing. You think I'm going to let some bitter woman chase away the best thing that's happened to me in 5 years? Boone rose slowly, his full height impressive, even in the open pasture. "The best thing?" Margaret turned to face him, her heart pounding with the audacity of what she was about to admit. "Yes, you, this, whatever this is between us. I know it's complicated. I know there are obstacles. But I also know that for the first time since Thomas died, I wake up looking forward to the day, instead of just enduring it." They stood facing each other across 3 feet of grass, the crumpled letter lying forgotten between them. Margaret could see the conflict in Boone's eyes, the war between hope and fear that she understood all too well. "I care about you," she said quietly, "more than I should, more than is sensible, more than I ever thought I'd care about anyone again. And if you care about me too, then we face whatever comes together." "I care about you more than my next breath," Boone said, his voice rough with emotion. "But Margaret, if Lydia comes here, if she starts talking, then we'll deal with it, together." Margaret stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I'm not some fragile flower that needs protection from the truth, Boone. I'm a woman who's fought for everything she has, and I'm willing to fight for this too." Boone reached out slowly, as if she might disappear if he moved too quickly. His large hand cupped her cheek with infinite gentleness, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You deserve better than a man with my kind of baggage. I deserve a man who treats me like an equal, who respects my strength while cherishing my vulnerabilities, who makes me laugh and makes me think and makes me feel alive again." Margaret leaned into his touch. "I deserve you, if you're brave enough to let me have you." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable. Boone bent his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Margaret rose to meet him instead. His lips were warm and gentle, tasting of coffee and promises, and when his arms came around her, she felt safer and more cherished than she had in years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Margaret rested her forehead against his chest. She could hear his heart racing beneath her ear, could feel the tension in his body as he held her. "What happens now?" he asked, echoing her question from weeks before. "Now we stop being afraid of what other people might think and start being honest about what we want." Margaret pulled back to look at him. "Now we decide that some things are worth fighting for." Boone's smile was like sunrise after a long, cold night. "I've never had anything worth fighting for before, not since my mother died." "Well, you do now." Margaret picked up the crumpled letter and smoothed it out. "Let's see exactly what we're up against." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans, discussing strategies for dealing with Lydia's threats and the potential scandal that might follow. But underneath the practical concerns, Margaret felt a deep sense of rightness. as if all the pieces of her life were finally falling into their proper places. That evening, as they walked back toward the house together, Boone caught her hand in his. The simple gesture sent warmth shooting through her entire body, and she realized that she'd been starving for affection without even knowing it. "Margaret," Boone said as they paused at the fork in the path that led to his cabin, "are you sure about this, about us? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to being just employer and employee." Margaret squeezed his hand tighter. "I crossed that line the night I found you crying by the river. Everything since then has just been me catching up to my own heart." They stood in the gathering twilight, hands linked, both aware that they were choosing each other despite the obstacles that lay ahead. It wasn't the safe choice, the practical choice, the choice that society would approve of, but it was theirs, and that made it the right choice. As Margaret walked the final stretch to her house alone, she realized that the future she'd been so carefully controlling had suddenly become beautifully uncertain. For the first time in years, she didn't know exactly what tomorrow would bring, and she found that the uncertainty thrilled rather than frightened her. Change, it seemed, was finally ready to find her. Margaret woke the next morning to the sound of rain drumming against her bedroom windows. She lay in bed for several minutes, listening to the storm and thinking about the conversation she needed to have with herself. For 5 years, Thomas's portrait had watched over her sleep from its place above the fireplace, a constant reminder of duty, propriety, and the life she'd left behind. But that life felt like a costume she'd outgrown, and it was time to acknowledge the woman she'd become. Rising from bed, she walked to the fireplace and lifted the portrait from its hook. Thomas's painted eyes seemed to regard her with their usual mild expression, neither approving nor disapproving. Just present, the way he'd been in life there but not quite engaged, loving but not understanding. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the canvas. "I'm sorry I tried to become the woman you wanted, instead of discovering who I really was. I'm sorry I used your death as an excuse to stop living, but I'm not sorry anymore." With steady hands, she turned the portrait to face the wall. It wasn't an act of anger or rejection, but one of release. Thomas deserved to be remembered with affection rather than obligation, and she deserved to move forward without his ghost dictating her choices. The rain was still falling when she made her way to the kitchen, but she could see through the window that Boone was already at work in the barn, tending to the animals despite the weather. Something about his dedication in the face of the storm made her chest tight with emotion. This was a man who understood responsibility, who cared for what was entrusted to him whether anyone was watching or not. She was pouring her second cup of coffee when Pete knocked on the kitchen door, his hat dripping and his expression concerned. "Morning, Mrs. Waverley. Hate to bother you so early, but we've got a problem with the creek. All this rain's got it running higher than I've seen in years, and there's a section of fence that's about to wash out." Margaret set down her cup immediately. "Show me." They rode out together through the steady downpour, Margaret's practical split skirt and oiled coat protecting her from the worst of the weather. The creek that normally ran gentle and shallow had indeed swollen to a rushing torrent, carrying branches and debris from upstream. The fence line that marked her property boundary was already partially submerged, and Margaret could see that several posts were leaning dangerously. "If that fence goes, we'll lose the cattle in the south pasture," Pete shouted over the sound of rushing water. "They'll either be swept downstream or scatter into the county. Either way, we'll spend weeks trying to round them up. What do we need to do?" "Need to reinforce the posts that are still standing and build a temporary barrier upstream to redirect the water. It's going to take all hands working together, and even then," Pete's words were cut off by a tremendous crack as one of the fence posts snapped in half, taking a section of wire with it. Without hesitation, Margaret spurred her horse toward the barn, where she knew the rest of the crew would be taking shelter from the storm. But when she arrived, she found only half her usual workforce. 3 of the men had taken ill with a fever that was going around town, and 2 others were stranded at their homes by flooding roads. "We don't have enough men," Pete said grimly as they surveyed their reduced crew. This job needs at least 8 bodies, and we've got 5. 6. Boone's voice came from behind them, and Margaret turned to see him emerging from a stall where he'd been checking on a pregnant mare. "I'll work the creek." "Boone, that water's dangerous," Margaret protested. "One slip and you could be swept away." "Could be, but won't be." His dark eyes met hers steadily. "I grew up on a farm in Kansas, remember? I've dealt with floods before. Besides, someone needs to handle the heavy work, and I'm the biggest man you've got." Over the next 6 hours, Margaret watched Boone prove himself in ways that had nothing to do with gentleness or quiet competence. Working in water up to his chest, fighting against a current that could have easily carried away a smaller man. He anchored posts and strung wire with the methodical determination of someone who understood that failure meant catastrophe. Margaret worked alongside him, hauling supplies and holding posts steady while he drove them into the muddy creek bed. She was soaked within minutes, her hair plastered to her head and her clothes clinging uncomfortably, but she didn't care. This was her land, her livelihood, and she'd be damned if she'd watch it wash away from the safety of her porch. "Margaret, you need to get back," Boone called during a brief lull in the work. "This water's getting higher, and if something happens, you'll need all the help you can get," she replied, refusing to budge from her position. "We're in this together, remember?" By late afternoon, they'd managed to construct a temporary barrier that redirected the worst of the current away from the remaining fence posts. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold until the water receded and they could make permanent repairs. The crew trudged back to the barn, exhausted but triumphant, their clothes sodden and their boots squelching with every step. Margaret was toweling her hair dry when she noticed that the other men were looking at Boone with new respect. The quiet drifter had become something else in their eyes during the long day's work, a man who'd risk his life to protect what mattered, who'd stand shoulder to shoulder with them against whatever nature threw their way. "Hell of a thing," Pete said quietly to Margaret as they watched Boone check on the horses one final time before heading to his cabin. "Never seen a man work in conditions like that without complaint. Most folks would have found an excuse to stay dry." "He's not most folks," Margaret replied, surprised by the pride in her own voice. That evening, Margaret found herself walking through the rain toward Boone's cabin, carrying a basket of hot soup and dry clothes. She told herself she was simply being considerate to a valuable employee, but the truth was more complicated. The day had shown her something about the man she was falling in love with, something that went beyond his gentleness with animals or his skill with his hands. She'd seen his courage, his willingness to put others before himself, his quiet leadership when leadership was needed. She'd also seen the way he looked at her when he thought she was taking too great a risk, the protective instinct that he tried to mask but couldn't quite hide. The cabin was warm and welcoming when she arrived, lamplight glowing through the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. Boone opened the door before she could knock, as if he'd been waiting for her. "You should be home by your fire, not wandering around in this weather," he said, but his eyes were warm as he took the basket from her hands. "So should you, but here we are." Margaret stepped inside, noting the improvements he'd made to the space. Bookshelves lined one wall, already filled with volumes she'd lent him. A comfortable chair sat near the fireplace, with his mother's Bible resting on a small table beside it. The carved horse held a place of honor on the mantel, and the entire space felt like a real home rather than temporary shelter. "I brought soup," she said, suddenly feeling shy in the intimate space. "And some of Thomas's old clothes. They might be a little loose, but they're dry." "That's thoughtful of you." Boone ladled the soup into bowls while Margaret hung her wet coat by the fire. "You didn't have to venture out in this storm?" "I wanted to. I wanted to thank you for what you did today, the way you stepped up when we needed you most." Margaret accepted a bowl of soup and settled into the chair across from his. "Pete thinks you saved the ranch." "Pete gives me too much credit. We all worked together." "Yes, but you were the one willing to risk the most. You were the one who didn't hesitate when the situation got dangerous." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "That means something, Boone. That says everything about who you are." They ate in comfortable silence, the storm continuing to rage outside, while the cabin remained a warm sanctuary. Margaret found herself studying the way firelight played across Boone's features, the way his large hands held the delicate soup spoon with surprising grace. Everything about him spoke of contrasts, strength and gentleness, size and delicacy, power and restraint. "Margaret," Boone said suddenly, setting down his empty bowl. "About yesterday, about what happened between us. Are you having second thoughts?" "No, God, no." He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes intense. "If anything, today made me more certain. Watching you work beside me in that flood, seeing your determination to protect what's yours, you're the strongest person I've ever known. Man or woman, it doesn't matter. You're extraordinary." Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the soup or the fire. "You make me feel extraordinary. For the first time in my life, I feel like someone sees who I really am, instead of who they think I should be." "And who are you, really?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibility. Margaret set down her own bowl and considered her answer carefully. "I'm someone who thought she knew what love was and discovered she'd never experienced it. I'm someone who spent 5 years building walls and just realized she doesn't want to live behind them anymore. I'm someone who's tired of being safe and ready to be happy instead." Boone rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his large, calloused ones. "Margaret, I need you to be sure, really sure, because I'm falling in love with you, and if you're not ready for that, if you're not certain you want that kind of complication in your life, you need to tell me now." The words hit her like lightning, illuminating feelings she'd been afraid to name. Love. Not the comfortable affection she'd felt for Thomas, not the gratitude disguised as devotion she'd convinced herself was enough. This was love in all its terrifying, exhilarating glory, the kind that changed everything, that made you willing to risk everything. "I'm sure," she whispered, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I'm more sure of this than I've been of anything in my entire life." When Boone kissed her this time, it was with the hunger of a man who'd been holding back too long. Margaret melted into his embrace, her hands tangling in his dark hair, her body coming alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. This was what she'd been missing all those years, this fire, this passion, this sense of being fully known and completely cherished. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small cabin, two hearts found shelter in each other. Margaret had spent 5 years believing that love was something that happened to other people, something she'd had her chance at and lost. But as she held Boone close, feeling his heart beat against her chest, she realized that sometimes the greatest love comes not in youth, but in maturity, not in innocence, but in understanding. She was 42 years old, widowed, set in her ways, and absolutely terrified of the depth of her feelings for this gentle giant who'd wandered into her life. And she'd never been happier. Outside, thunder rolled across the prairie, but Margaret barely heard it. She was too busy falling in love with a man who saw her strength as beautiful and her independence as precious, who made her feel like the heroine of her own story instead of a supporting character in someone else's. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain and challenging and full of obstacles they'd have to face together. But for tonight, in the warm glow of lamplight and newfound love, anything seemed possible. The wanted poster arrived with Sheriff Morrison on a Wednesday morning, carried like a death sentence in his weathered hands. Margaret was in her study, reviewing the books, when she heard the sound of official boots on her porch, followed by the kind of knock that meant serious business. Through the window, she could see Boone working with the horses in the far pasture, unaware that his carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing down. "Mrs. Waverley," Sheriff Morrison said when she opened the door. He was a decent man, fair and practical, who'd known her since before her marriage. His presence on her doorstep at this hour meant trouble of the worst kind. "I'm afraid we need to talk." "Of course. Come in." Margaret led him to the parlor, her mind racing through possibilities. Had someone complained about Boone? Had Judge Hartwell made good on his implied threats? What can I do for you, Sheriff? Morrison settled his bulk into one of her chairs and pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. I received this telegram yesterday from the Territorial Marshal's office. They're looking for a man in connection with a theft that occurred 8 years ago in Kansas. Man named Boone Maddox. Margaret's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She kept her expression carefully neutral, but her hands clenched into fists in her lap. I see. And you believe this man might be in our area? Ma'am, I know he's in our area. He's been working for you for the past 2 months. Morrison unfolded the poster, revealing a crude but recognizable sketch of Boone's face above the words "Wanted for theft" and "500 reward." The description matches, the name matches, and frankly, the timing of his arrival matches too perfectly for coincidence. Margaret stared at the poster, her heart breaking as she read the details. Boone Maddox, aged 22 at the time of the crime, wanted for breaking and entering, theft of medical supplies, and resisting arrest. The charges were exactly as he described them to her, but seeing them laid out in stark black and white made them seem so much worse, so much more serious. Sheriff, surely you can't be certain this is the same man. Boone Maddox isn't such an uncommon name. Mrs. Waverley. Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know when someone's running from something, and I know when a good woman is trying to protect someone she cares about. But the law is the law, and this man is wanted by the territorial authorities. What are the charges, specifically? Margaret forced herself to ask the question, though she already knew the answer. Breaking into Dr. Samuel Hartley's clinic in Topeka, Kansas, stole approximately $50 worth of medical supplies, mostly laudanum and fever medicine. When Dr. Hartley caught him in the act, the suspect struck him and fled. Dr. Hartley suffered a broken nose and considerable bruising. Morrison refolded the poster. There's also the matter of his mother, Sarah Maddox, who died 3 days after the theft. Some folks think the son was trying to sell the medicine for profit rather than use it to help her. And what do you think? Margaret asked quietly. Morrison sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. I think a desperate young man made a stupid choice trying to save his dying mother. I think he's probably spent the last 8 years regretting it and trying to make amends. But Margaret, what I think doesn't matter. There's a warrant out for his arrest, and bounty hunters are starting to circle. I got word that at least 2 men are already asking questions in town. Margaret felt the walls of her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Bounty hunters? Hard men who care more about the reward money than justice. They'll take him back to Kansas whether he comes willingly or not, and they won't be gentle about it. Morrison leaned forward in his chair. Mrs. Waverley, I've known you since you were Thomas's young bride. You're one of the finest people in this county, and I'd hate to see you dragged down by association with a wanted man. Dragged down how? Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime. Even if you didn't know who he was when you hired him, continuing to employ him now that you do know could make you an accessory. Your reputation, your ranch, everything you've built it could all be at risk. Margaret stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the pasture where Boone continued his work, oblivious to the catastrophe bearing down on him. He looked so peaceful, so content, moving among the horses with that gentle confidence she'd come to love. The thought of losing him, of watching bounty hunters drag him away in chains, made her feel physically ill. What are my options, Sheriff? You could terminate his employment immediately and make it clear to anyone who asks that you had no knowledge of his past. Distance yourself completely. Morrison's voice was carefully neutral. Or you could convince him to turn himself in voluntarily. Might go easier for him if he surrenders rather than being taken by force. And if I do neither, then you risk losing everything you've worked for. Your ranch, your standing in the community, possibly your freedom if the territorial authorities decide to prosecute you for harboring a fugitive. Morrison stood and moved to join her at the window. Margaret, I know you care about this man. It's written all over your face, but you can't save him by destroying yourself. Margaret watched Boone gentle, a skittish colt, his massive hands patient and sure. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, kind, protective, skilled, honorable. The idea that he could be hunted like an animal, treated like a common criminal, made rage burn in her chest. "How long do I have?" she asked quietly. "The bounty hunters are asking questions, but they haven't located him yet. A day, maybe two, before they piece together where he's been staying." Morrison placed a hand on her shoulder. "Margaret, please, think about what you're risking here. Is any man worth losing everything for?" After the sheriff left, Margaret sat alone in her parlor, staring at the wanted poster. The crude sketch made Boone look brutish, dangerous, nothing like the gentle soul she'd come to know. But the facts were damning. He'd broken into a doctor's office, stolen medicine, and injured a man who'd tried to stop him. To anyone who didn't know the full story, he would seem like exactly the kind of criminal who deserved to be behind bars. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Boone by the river, when he'd told her about his mother's death and his desperate attempt to save her. She'd understood then why he'd made the choice he did, had even admired him for it in a way. But seeing it reduced to legal terminology on an official document made her question whether she'd been naive, whether her feelings had clouded her judgment. Margaret rose and walked to her bedroom, where Thomas's portrait still faced the wall. She turned it around and stared into her late husband's painted eyes, searching for guidance that didn't come. Thomas had been a law-abiding man, a pillar of the community who would have been horrified by the situation she found herself in. He would have told her to do her duty, to uphold the law regardless of personal feelings. But Thomas had never faced a choice between love and safety, had never been forced to choose between his heart and his security. He'd lived his entire life following the prescribed path, never questioning whether the rules were just or whether sometimes love demanded a higher law. Margaret turned the portrait back to the wall and walked to her dresser, where she opened the small velvet box containing her wedding ring. The simple gold band caught the afternoon light, and she remembered the young woman who'd worn it so hopefully, so trustingly. That woman had believed that love meant security, that marriage meant never having to face difficult choices alone. She was no longer that woman. The sound of boots on the porch interrupted her thoughts, and Margaret hurried downstairs, expecting to find the sheriff returning with more bad news. Instead, she opened the door to find Boone standing there with a bunch of wildflowers in his hand and a smile on his face that made her heart break all over again. "Thought you might like these," he said, offering her the flowers. "Found them growing by the creek where we first met. Seemed fitting." Margaret accepted the flowers with trembling hands, their beauty almost painful in light of what she now knew. "Boone, we need to talk." Something in her tone made his smile fade. "What's wrong?" "Come inside, please." They sat in the parlor where she'd received the sheriff's devastating news, and Margaret found herself unable to meet Boone's eyes as she pulled the wanted poster from where she'd hidden it in her skirt pocket. "Sheriff Morrison came to see me this morning," she said quietly, unfolding the paper. "He brought this." She watched Boone's face as he took in the poster, saw the color drain from his cheeks as he stared at his own crude likeness. His hands shook as he read the charges, and when he looked up at her, his dark eyes were filled with a pain so deep it took her breath away. "You know," he said simply. "I know." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "All of it. The theft, Dr. Hartley, your mother's death 3 days later. I know about the bounty hunters who are looking for you, and I know that anyone who helps you is risking everything they have." Boone set the poster aside and buried his face in his hands. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was his ragged breathing. When he finally looked up, his expression was one of complete defeat. "I should have told you the whole truth from the beginning," he said. "Should have given you the choice of whether to get involved with someone like me. But I was selfish, Margaret. For the first time in 8 years, I was happy, and I didn't want to give that up." "Someone like you?" Margaret's voice sharpened. "What does that mean exactly?" "A criminal. A man who broke the law and hurt an innocent person. A man who's been running from his mistakes for 8 years instead of facing them like he should have." Boone's voice was flat, emotionless. "The sheriff's right, you know." You should distance yourself from me before this destroys everything you've built." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "Is that what you think of yourself, that you're some kind of monster who doesn't deserve happiness? I think I'm a man who made choices that have consequences. And I think those consequences shouldn't fall on the woman I love." Boone stood abruptly. "I'll be gone by morning. Packed and disappeared before anyone can connect you to harboring a fugitive." "Sit down," Margaret said sharply. "Margaret," I said, "sit down." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and Boone slowly sank back into his chair. "Now listen to me very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. You are not a monster. You are not a criminal who deserves to spend his life running. You are a man who made one desperate choice in an impossible situation, and you've spent 8 years paying for it in ways that no court of law would ever require. The law doesn't see it that way. The law sees what's written on paper. I see the man who risked his life to save my cattle in a flood. I see the man who gentles frightened horses and carves beautiful things with his hands. I see the man who loved his mother enough to risk everything for her, and who's been punishing himself ever since because his sacrifice wasn't enough to save her." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "That's not a criminal, Boone. That's a man with the biggest heart I've ever known." Tears spilled down Boone's cheeks, and Margaret felt her own eyes fill in response. "It doesn't matter what you see in me. What matters is what a jury will see, what a judge will decide. I can't ask you to throw away your life for someone who's not worth saving." "You're not asking," Margaret said firmly. I'm choosing you, choosing us, choosing to fight for something that matters more than reputation or safety or what other people think." Margaret woke before dawn the next morning with the weight of her father's hunting rifle in her hands. She'd retrieved it from the gun cabinet in Thomas's study, along with a box of ammunition that had sat unused for years. The weapon was familiar in her gripper. Father had taught her to shoot when she was 12, believing that any woman living on the frontier should know how to protect herself. She'd never imagined she'd need those skills to protect the man she loved. The morning light revealed 2 riders approaching the ranch, moving with the purposeful gait of men who had business to conduct. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as they dismounted near the main gate, noting their hard faces and the way their hands rested casually on their gun belts. Bounty hunters, just as Sheriff Morrison had warned. She dressed quickly in her riding clothes and made her way downstairs, checking that the rifle was loaded before setting it within easy reach of the front door. Whatever happened today, she wouldn't let them take Boone without a fight. The knock came as she was finishing her coffee, sharp and demanding. Margaret opened the door to find 2 men standing on her porchon, tall and lean with pale eyes and a mustache that didn't hide his cruel mouth. The other shorter and broader, with scars crisscrossing his hands. Both wore the dusty clothes and hard expressions of men who made their living from other people's misfortunes. "Mrs. Waverley." The tall one touched his hat brim in a gesture that was more mockery than courtesy. "Name's Jake Coulter, and this is my partner, Dutch Morrison. We're here on official business regarding a fugitive from justice." "I see. And what fugitive would that be?" "Man named Boone Maddox. We have reliable information that he's been working for you." Coulter pulled out the same wanted poster Sheriff Morrison had shown her, now creased and worn from handling. "We're authorized by the territorial government to bring him back to Kansas to face trial." Margaret kept her expression carefully neutral. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed, gentlemen. I employ several ranch hands, but none by the name of Boone Maddox." Dutch spoke for the first time, his voice rough as gravel. "Ma'am, we've been tracking this man for weeks. We know he's here, and we know you've been harboring him. Now, you can make this easy on yourself by telling us where he is, or we can search the property ourselves." "I'm afraid I can't allow that without a proper warrant," Margaret replied calmly. "This is private property, and you have no legal authority here without court documents." Coulter's smile was cold and humorless. "Mrs. Waverley, you seem like a respectable woman. It would be a shame if you got caught up in something that could ruin your reputation and your business." All we want is the fugitive. Cooperate with us, and there's no reason anyone needs to know you were involved. And if I don't cooperate, then we'll make sure everyone knows you've been harboring a wanted criminal. Judge, jury, newspapers, they'll all hear about how the famous widow Waverley chose a thief over the law. Dutch's scarred hands flexed at his sides. Might be hard to keep running a ranch when no decent folks will do business with you. Margaret felt anger burn cold in her chest. These men thought they could intimidate her with threats and insinuations, thought a woman alone would crumble under pressure. They had no idea what she'd already survived, what she was capable of when something she loved was threatened. Gentlemen, I believe I've made my position clear. Mr. Maddox is not on my property, and you have no authority to search it. I suggest you take your business elsewhere. She moved to close the door, but Coulter's boot blocked it. Mrs. Waverley, I don't think you understand the situation here. We're not asking for your permission. We're taking that man back to Kansas, and anyone who gets in our way is going to regret it. And I don't think you understand my situation. Margaret's voice dropped to a deadly quiet. You're trespassing on my land, threatening me in my own home, and attempting to intimidate a law-abiding citizen. Sheriff Morrison is a personal friend of mine, and I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear about your methods. Dutch laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. Sheriff Morrison's the one who told us where to find you, lady. He's got no love for fugitives or the people who protect them. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Morrison had seemed sympathetic, had acted like he was trying to help her make the right choice. Had he been playing both sides all along? Had her trust been misplaced once again? Before she could respond, she heard the sound of boots on the porch behind the bounty hunters. Pete Rodriguez appeared, flanked by two other ranch hands, all three men carrying rifles and wearing expressions that could have melted steel. Mrs. Waverley, Pete said politely, though his eyes never left the intruders. These gentlemen bothering you? They're just leaving, Margaret replied, relief flooding through her at the sight of her loyal foreman. Weren't you, gentlemen? Coulter's pale eyes flicked between Pete's rifle and the determined faces of the ranch hands. This isn't over, Mrs. Waverley. We know Maddox is here, and we're not giving up. We'll be watching every road, every trail. He can't hide forever. After the bounty hunters rode away, Margaret slumped against her doorframe, suddenly feeling every one of her 42 years. The confrontation had been worse than she'd expected, more threatening and personal. These weren't lawmen seeking justice, they were predators hunting prey, and they wouldn't be deterred by legal niceties or moral arguments. Where is Boone? Pete asked quietly. I sent him to check the north pasture fence line before dawn, told him to stay out of sight until these men moved on. Margaret looked at her foreman's weathered face, seeing concern and loyalty there. Pete, you don't have to get involved in this. If things go bad, it could affect you too. Mrs. Waverley, I've worked for this ranch for 12 years. I've seen you weather your husband's death, near bankruptcy, drought, flood, and every challenge the land could throw at you. You think I'm going to abandon you now because some bounty hunters don't like the company you keep? Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Boone's a good man, Pete. Whatever those papers say, whatever people think they know about him, he's a good man who made one mistake trying to save his mother. I know. We all know. Pete gestured toward the other ranch hands. Any man who'd work in floodwater to save the herd, who treats animals with kindness and never asks for more than fair wages, that's not a criminal, ma'am. That's just a man who's had some hard luck. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Margaret sent telegrams to every doctor named Hartley she could find in Kansas, desperately hoping to locate the man Boone had injured 8 years earlier. She wrote to lawyers in 3 territories, seeking advice on fighting extradition orders. She even composed a letter to the territorial governor, though she held little hope that a politician would risk his reputation for a wanted man and the woman who loved him. As evening approached, she made her way to the old cabin where she and Boone had agreed to meet. The building looked different now, more finished and welcoming. Boone had been working on it steadily, turning it from a derelict structure into a real home. Margaret realized with a pang that he'd been building their future, even while knowing his past might destroy it. She found him sitting on the porch steps, his mother's Bible open in his lap. But instead of reading, he was staring out at the mountains, his expression distant and troubled. "The bounty hunters came this morning," Margaret said without preamble. Boone's shoulders sagged. "I saw them from the ridge, recognized the type even from a distance. How bad was it? They threatened to ruin my reputation if I don't cooperate. Made it clear they're not going away quietly." Margaret sat beside him on the steps. "They also claimed Sheriff Morrison told them where to find me. Morrison's not a bad man. He's probably trying to end this with as little bloodshed as possible." Boone closed the Bible and set it aside. "Margaret, this is exactly what I was afraid of. These men won't stop until they have me, and they don't care who gets hurt in the process. Then we don't give them the chance to hurt anyone." Margaret pulled a telegram from her pocket. "I sent word to every Dr. Hartley in Kansas. If we can find the man you injured, if we can get him to speak on your behalf." "It's been 8 years, Margaret. Even if he's still alive, even if we could find him, why would he help me? I broke his nose and left him bleeding on his clinic floor. Because maybe he understands that desperate people do desperate things. Because maybe he's seen enough suffering to know that punishment isn't always the same as justice." Margaret took his hand in hers. "We have to try, Boone. It's the only chance we have." They spent the evening planning, discussing routes out of the territory if negotiations failed, identifying allies who might help hide Boone if running became necessary. But underneath the practical preparations, both of them knew they were fighting a battle with odds stacked heavily against them. As the sun set, Margaret found herself studying Boone's profile in the golden light. His face was peaceful despite the circumstances, and she realized that whatever happened, she regretted nothing. These past months with him had been the happiest of her life, worth whatever price she might have to pay. "Margaret," Boone said suddenly, "there's something I need to give you." He disappeared into the cabin and returned with a small bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Inside was the carved horse he'd made for his mother, the one he'd been carrying the night she found him by the river. "I want you to have this," he said, placing it gently in her hands. "If things go badly tomorrow, if they take me away, I want you to have something to remember that our time together mattered. That you mattered to me more than anything else in this world." Margaret stared at the exquisite carving, her vision blurring with tears. "Don't talk like that. Don't talk like we're already defeated." "I'm not defeated. I'm prepared." Boone cupped her face in his large hands. "Margaret, whatever happens, you've given me something I never thought I'd have again, hope. You've shown me that even a man like me can be worthy of love, can build something beautiful instead of just running from something ugly. That's a gift I'll carry with me no matter where I end up." They held each other as darkness fell over the ranch, two people facing an uncertain future with nothing but love and determination to sustain them. In the distance, they could see the lights of Silverbrush Crossing, where gossip and judgment waited like vultures. But in the small circle of warmth they'd created, none of that mattered. Tomorrow would bring the fight of their lives. Tonight, they simply held each other close and tried to memorize the feeling of being completely, perfectly understood by another human being. The carved horse rested in Margaret's palm between them, a symbol of love and loss, and the possibility that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you get a second chance at happiness worth fighting for. Margaret's mother's wedding dress hung in the back of her wardrobe like a ghost of dreams deferred. She hadn't seen it in years, hadn't thought about it since the dark months after Thomas's death, when even the sight of white lace had seemed like mockery. But this morning, as she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life, she found herself pulling the yellowed silk from its hiding place and holding it against her body. The dress was simpler than the elaborate gown she'd worn to marry Thomas, more suited to her mother's practical nature than the social expectations of Margaret's generation. It spoke of love chosen rather than love arranged, of promises made from the heart rather than obligation. Her mother had worn it to marry for love the second time, after being widowed young, and told she should settle for security instead of passion. Margaret had never understood her mother's choice until now. She was still holding the dress when Pete's urgent knock came at her door. "Mrs. Waverley, you need to come quick. There's been developments." Margaret threw on her robe and rushed downstairs to find Pete standing in her kitchen with a telegram in his hands and an expression of barely controlled excitement on his weathered face. "It's from Kansas," he said, thrusting the yellow paper toward her, "from a Dr. Samuel Hartley in Topeka." Margaret's hands shook as she unfolded the telegram and read, "Mrs. Waverley, stop. Received your inquiry about Boone Maddox. Stop, remember incident well. Stop, young man, desperate to save dying mother. Stop, never press charges personally. Stop, will testify on his behalf. Stop arriving Silverbrush Crossing. Tomorrow. Stop, Dr. Samuel Hartley." Margaret read the message 3 times before the words fully sank in. Dr. Hartley was alive, remembered Boone, and was willing to help. More than bathed, never personally pressed charges, which meant the warrant might have been issued by overzealous law enforcement rather than the injured party himself. "Pete, this changes everything," she breathed. "If Dr. Hartley testifies that he doesn't want to prosecute, if he explains the circumstances, the bounty hunters won't care." Pete interrupted grimly. "They've got a legal warrant and a $500 reward. They're not going to give that up because the victim has second thoughts." Margaret's elation faded as the reality of their situation reasserted itself. Legal documents and moral arguments meant nothing to men like Coulter and Dutch. They would take Boone back to Kansas regardless of Dr. Hartley's testimony and worry about the legal complications later. "Then we have to make sure they don't get the chance," she said quietly. "Ma'am?" Margaret straightened her shoulders and felt steel enter her spine. "Get word to Boone. Tell him to meet me at the river bend at noon. And Pete, tell the men to be ready. If those bounty hunters want to fight, we'll give them one they won't forget." The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret cleaned and loaded every weapon on the ranch, distributed them among the hands who were willing to stand with her, and sent messages to neighbors who might be sympathetic to their cause. By the time she rode out to meet Boone, she had 8 armed men ready to defend him and a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. She found Boone waiting by the river where their story had begun, his face grave but determined. He'd armed himself with a rifle and wore the expression of a man who'd finally decided to stop running. "Pete told me about the telegram," he said as she dismounted. "Margaret, this is wonderful news, but it doesn't solve our immediate problem," she finished. "The bounty hunters are still out there, still planning to take you back. Dr. Hartley's testimony might clear your name eventually, but you have to survive long enough for that to matter. So what do we do?" Margaret moved to stand directly in front of him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "We make our stand here, all of it. The ranch hands, the neighbors who support us, everyone who believes that justice is more than just following orders. We show those bounty hunters that some people are worth fighting for." Boone stared at her in amazement. "Margaret, you can't ask people to risk their lives for me. If shooting starts, if someone gets killed, it will be because they chose to stand up for what's right instead of what's easy." Margaret reached up and touched his face, memorizing the feel of his skin under her fingers. "Boone, I've spent 5 years living safely, keeping my head down, avoiding anything that might upset my carefully ordered world. And I've been miserable. Not unhappy exactly, but not truly living either. You've been surviving, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with surviving, but there's everything wrong with settling for survival when you could have life instead." Margaret smiled, feeling strangely peaceful despite the danger surrounding them. "You've shown me what it means to be fully alive, to care about something more than safety and reputation. I'm not giving that up without a fight." The sound of approaching horses cut through their conversation. Margaret and Boone turned to see riders emerging from the trees, not bounty hunters, but Sheriff Morrison, accompanied by a man Margaret didn't recognize. The stranger was elderly, well-dressed, and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mrs. Waverley, Mr. Maddox. Sheriff Morrison called as they approached. I'd like you to meet Territorial Judge Harrison. He's here to sort out this situation once and for all. Judge Harrison dismounted with the careful movements of a man past his prime but still sharp as a blade. His eyes were kind but stern, and Margaret could see intelligence and fairness in his weathered features. Mrs. Waverley, I've heard a great deal about you, the judge said, touching his hat brim courteously. Your reputation for integrity precedes you, and Mr. Maddox have been reviewing your case with great interest. Your Honor, Boone said carefully, I'm prepared to surrender myself to proper authorities if you'll guarantee Mrs. Waverley won't be prosecuted for helping me. That's very noble of you, son, but it may not be necessary. Judge Harrison pulled a leather folder from his saddlebags. I've been in contact with Dr. Samuel Hartley in Topeka. Fascinating conversation. It seems the good doctor has some very specific opinions about your case. Margaret felt her heart leap. He contacted you directly? Indeed he did. Sent a telegram to my office as soon as he received Mrs. Waverley's inquiry. Seems he's been trying to have the charges against Mr. Maddox dropped for years, but the bureaucracy moves slowly and no one knew where to find the defendant. Judge Harrison opened the folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. Hartley never wanted to prosecute, you see. The charges were filed by an overzealous prosecutor who thought he was protecting a victim who didn't want protection. Boone swayed on his feet as if the words had physically struck him. He never wanted to prosecute? Dr. Hartley told me that you left money to pay for the medicine you took, that you were clearly desperate and grieving, and that the injury he sustained was accidental, a result of his trying to restrain you rather than any intent to harm on your part. Judge Harrison's voice was gentle. He said, and I quote, "That young man was trying to save his mother's life. Any father would have done the same thing." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched Boone absorb this information. For 8 years, he'd been running from a crime that the victim had forgiven before it was ever prosecuted. For 8 years, he'd been punishing himself for something that had already been pardoned by the only person who had the right to forgive. What does this mean? Margaret asked through her tears. It means that as of this morning, all charges against Boone Maddox have been officially dropped, Judge Harrison announced. The warrant has been recalled, and any bounty hunters operating under its authority are now guilty of attempted kidnapping if they try to apprehend him. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his expression apologetic. Mrs. Waverley, I owe you an explanation about those bounty hunters. I didn't send them to you. They came to me with a legal warrant, and I was obligated to confirm that Maddox was working for you. But I also sent word to Judge Harrison about the situation, hoping he could find a legal solution that wouldn't require anyone to get hurt. Margaret felt weak with relief. So it's over? Boone is free? Free as any man in the territory, Judge Harrison confirmed, though I suspect those bounty hunters aren't going to take the news well. Men like that don't like losing their payday, and they might not be willing to accept that their warrant is worthless. As if summoned by his words, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed echoed through the trees. Margaret counted at least 6 riders, and her heart sank as she recognized Coulter and Dutch among them. The bounty hunters had brought reinforcements, and they were riding hard toward the river bend. Get behind me, Boone said, moving to shield Margaret from the approaching riders. Whatever they want, I won't let them hurt you. Actually, Margaret said, surprising herself with her calm, I think it's time they learned what it means to threaten the wrong woman. She mounted her horse and rode forward to meet the bounty hunters, Judge Harrison and Sheriff Morrison flanking her, Boone close behind. The carved horse from his mother rested in her saddlebag, a reminder of love and sacrifice and the courage it took to fight for what mattered most. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Margaret Waverley had never felt more ready for a fight in her life. The bounty hunters reined in their horses 20 yards from Margaret's group, their faces hard with the frustration of men who sensed their payday slipping away. Coulter's pale eyes fixed on Boone with the intensity of a predator that had finally cornered its prey, while Dutch's scarred hands rested on his gun belt with practiced casualness. Mrs. Waverley, Coulter called out, his voice carrying false politeness over the sound of rushing water. I see you've brought help. That's fine, we can settle this legal-like. All we want is the fugitive, and then we'll be on our way. I'm afraid there's been a development in that regard, Judge Harrison said, urging his horse forward. Gentlemen, I am Territorial Judge Harrison, and I have some news concerning your warrant. Coulter's eyes narrowed as he took in the judge's official bearing. What kind of news? The kind that means your services are no longer required. Judge Harrison pulled the documents from his folder, holding them high enough for all the bounty hunters to see. As of this morning, all charges against Boone Maddox have been officially dropped. Your warrant is void, and any attempt to apprehend him will be considered kidnapping under territorial law. The effect of these words on the bounty hunters was immediate and volatile. Dutch cursed fluently, while two of the other men exchanged uncertain glances. But Coulter's expression didn't change, and Margaret felt a chill as she recognized the look of a man who'd come too far to turn back empty-handed. That's a mighty convenient story, Judge, Coulter said, his voice dripping with disbelief. Funny how these legal developments always seem to happen just when we're about to collect our bounty. You got any proof of these so-called dropped charges? Judge Harrison held up the official documents, but Coulter waved them away dismissively. Papers can be forged, Your Honor. Especially when there's a wealthy woman involved who might be willing to pay for the right kind of paperwork. Margaret felt Boone tense beside her, saw his hand move instinctively toward his rifle. Easy, she murmured, though her own anger was building at the bounty hunter's implications. Mr. Coulter, Sheriff Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of years of law enforcement, Judge Harrison is a respected territorial official. If he says the charges are dropped, then they're dropped. I suggest you and your men move on before this situation gets out of hand. Or what? Dutch had found his voice again, and it carried the rough edge of a man spoiling for a fight. You going to arrest all 6 of us, Sheriff? You? And what army? As if in answer to his question, the sound of approaching horses echoed from multiple directions. Pete Rodriguez emerged from the trees to the north with 4 ranch hands, all armed and ready for trouble. From the south, Margaret saw Judge Hartwell riding hard with 2 of his deputies, though whether he was coming to help or cause more problems remained unclear. And from the east, a group of townspeople she recognized came into view, shopkeepers and farmers who had apparently decided that some fights were worth joining. Margaret counted quickly. They now had nearly 20 people arrayed against the 6 bounty hunters. The odds had shifted dramatically, but she knew that didn't necessarily make the situation safer. Desperate men with guns were dangerous regardless of numbers. Looks like the whole county's turned out, Coulter observed, his pale eyes scanning the assembled crowd. Mighty impressive show of force for one wanted man. Makes a person wonder what kind of hold he's got over all these good folks. The hold of decency, Margaret said, her voice ringing clear across the water. The hold of standing up for what's right instead of what's easy, something you wouldn't understand. Coulter's smile was cold as winter. Mrs. Waverley, you're a beautiful woman, and I'm sure this outlaw has filled your head with all kinds of romantic notions. But the fact remains we have a legal warrant. We've tracked our quarry to your ranch, and we're not leaving without him. Your warrant is worthless, Judge Harrison repeated firmly. I have the authority to void it, and I'm ordering you to stand down. And I'm ordering you to step aside, Coulter replied, his hand moving to his gun. We came here to do a job, and we're going to finish it. The tension in the air became almost unbearable. Margaret could see fingers tightening on triggers, could feel the weight of the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the riverbank would erupt in violence that would leave good people dead. It was Boone who broke the standoff, urging his horse forward until he was positioned between the 2 groups. Enough, he said, his deep voice carrying absolute authority. This has gone on long enough. Coulter, you want me? Here I am. But these people, all of these people, they're not part of this fight. Let them go, and we'll settle this between us. Boone, no, Margaret started, but he held up a hand to silence her. I've been running for 8 years, he continued, his eyes never leaving Coulter's face. "I'm tired of running, tired of other people paying the price for my mistakes. If you want to take me back to Kansas, if you think that warrant still has value, then let's end this now, just you and me." Coulter's grin was triumphant. "Now you're talking sense, Maddox. Though, I have to say, surrendering would have been a lot easier than all this drama." "I'm not surrendering," Boone said quietly. "I'm calling you out." The words hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Margaret felt her heart stop as she realized what Boone was. Proper Zinger gunfight, winner take all, with his freedom and possibly his life as the stakes. "You can't be serious," she breathed, but Boone's expression told her he was deadly serious. "I'm serious as a grave," Boone replied, still addressing Coulter. "You think you're man enough to take me in a fair fight? Then prove it. But when I win and I will win you, and your men ride out of here and never come back." Coulter laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in the sound. "And if I win?" 6 months later, Margaret stood in her bedroom adjusting her mother's wedding dress for the final time. The yellowed silk had been cleaned and altered to fit her perfectly, and as she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not the bitter widow who had closed her heart to love, but a woman who had learned that the greatest courage came not from avoiding pain, but from choosing joy despite the possibility of loss. The carved horse rested on her dresser, polished to a warm glow, and serving as something borrowed from the past to carry into the future. Beside it lay 2 new wedding ring simple gold bands that Boone had crafted himself from metal he'd bought with his own wages, each one inscribed with words of love in his careful handwriting. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to find Pete or one of the ranch hands with last-minute preparations. Instead, Dr. Samuel Hartley stepped into the room, his kind face beaming with paternal warmth. He'd arrived in Silverbrush Crossing 3 days earlier, determined to attend the wedding of the man whose desperate act of love had taught him something profound about the difference between justice and mercy. "My dear," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "you look absolutely radiant. Boone is the luckiest man alive." "Dr. Hartley, I can't thank you enough for coming all this way," Margaret said, taking his weathered hands in hers. "What you did for Boone, the courage it took to speak up after all these years." "Nonsense," the elderly doctor interrupted gently. "I should have done it years ago. I've regretted the delay every day since I learned that poor boy was living as a fugitive for a crime that was already forgiven in the only heart that mattered." His eyes grew distant. "You know, I've been thinking about that night 8 years ago quite a lot lately. About the young man who was so desperate to save his mother that he was willing to sacrifice his freedom for a few bottles of medicine. He still blames himself for her death," Margaret said quietly. "Still thinks he should have found another way. Perhaps. But I've come to believe that love doesn't always give us perfect choices sometimes. It only gives us the choice between action and inaction, between trying and giving up. Boone chose to try, even when the odds were impossible. That's not something to regret, that's something to honor." Dr. Hartley smiled and patted her hands gently. "He's a good man, my dear. A man who understands that strength isn't the absence of vulnerability, but the willingness to be vulnerable for the right reasons. You've chosen well." After he left, Margaret took one final look at her reflection. The woman in the mirror bore little resemblance to the one who had married Thomas 15 years earlier. That woman had been young and uncertain, looking for security in a world that seemed determined to deny it to anyone foolish enough to want more than survival. This woman was mature and strong, unafraid of the future, because she'd learned that love was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any leap of faith required to claim it. The ceremony was held by the river, where she'd first discovered Boone grieving for his mother, where their friendship had deepened into something neither had thought possible. The entire county seemed to have turned out for what many were calling the wedding of the decadeno, because of its grandeur, but because of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought the bride and groom together. Pete Rodriguez, resplendent in his best suit, walked Margaret down the makeshift aisle to where Boone stood waiting. The giant of a man who had once seemed so intimidating was dressed in a simple black suit, his dark hair neatly combed and his face glowing with happiness. When he saw her approaching in her mother's dress, his eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide. Judge Harrison, who had become something of a local hero since resolving the bounty hunter crisis, officiated the ceremony with warmth and humor. He spoke of second chances and the courage required to love again after loss, of the way two people could heal each other's wounds simply by choosing to see strength where others saw scars. "Do you, Margaret Waverley, take this man to be your husband?" Judge Harrison asked, his voice carrying across the water to where the assembled guests sat in rapt attention. "I do," Margaret said, her voice strong and clear. "I take him as my partner, my equal, my dearest friend, and the love I never thought I'd be brave enough to claim." "And do you, Boone Maddox, take this woman to be your wife?" Boone's voice was rough with emotion as he replied, "I do. I take her as my shelter and my storm, as the woman who taught me that even broken things can be made beautiful again if they're held by the right hands." When Judge Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled crowd could be heard all the way to town. Boone kissed Margaret with the tenderness of a man who understood the preciousness of the gift he'd been given, and she kissed him back with the passion of a woman who had finally learned the difference between settling and soaring. As the reception got underway, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers and genuine friendspeople who had stood by her during the crisis, who had risked their own safety to protect what she and Boone had built together. Even Judge Hartwell, who had initially opposed their relationship, had come to offer his congratulations and his grudging respect for a woman who had chosen love over convenience. "I was wrong about you," he admitted as they stood watching Boone dance with Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, his massive frame gentle as he spun the giggling child in circles. "I thought you needed protection from your own poor judgment. I didn't understand that you were capable of protecting yourself and others when it truly mattered." "We all make mistakes, Judge," Margaret replied graciously. "The important thing is learning from them." As the sun began to set over the river, Margaret and Boone slipped away from the celebration to walk alone along the water's edge. They found themselves at the spot where she'd first discovered him crying, where their journey together had truly begun. "Do you ever regret it?" Boone asked quietly, taking her hand in his. "Giving up your independence, your safe, predictable life? You could have had security with Judge Hartwell, respectability, a future without complications." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him fully, struck by the vulnerability still lurking in his dark eyes. Even now, even after everything they'd been through together, he sometimes doubted his worth, doubted whether he deserved the happiness he'd found. "Boone Maddox," she said firmly, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I didn't give up my independence when I married you. I chose to share it with someone who values it as much as I do. I didn't sacrifice my safety. I found a different kind of safety, the kind that comes from being known completely and loved unconditionally. And as for complications," she smiled, feeling mischievous, "my dear husband, life without complications isn't life at all. It's just existence." They kissed there by the river as the stars came out overhead, two people who had learned that the heart's capacity for love was infinite if you were brave enough to keep it open. Around them, the sounds of celebration continued, but in their small circle of lamplight and shared dreams, the only thing that mattered was the promise they'd made to each other. Later that night, as they sat on the porch of their finished cabin, sharing a cup of coffee and watching the moon rise over the mountains, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The carved horse sat on the mantel inside, no longer a symbol of grief, but of transformation, of the way love could take broken pieces and create something beautiful from them. "What are you thinking about?" Boone asked, noticing her distant expression. "I'm thinking about time," Margaret replied, settling more comfortably against his side. "About how I spent 5 years measuring it in duties and obligations, watching it pass like something I had to endure rather than something I could enjoy. And now I'm thinking about all the time we have ahead of Usul, the mornings we'll wake up together, all the evenings we'll spend on this porch, all the challenges we'll face as partners instead of alone." Sounds like a pretty good way to spend a life, Boone said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. It sounds like the only way to spend a life, Margaret corrected. At least the only way worth spending one. They sat, in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch settling down around them. In the distance, they could hear the cattle lowing softly, the horses moving restlessly in their paddocks, the creek continuing its eternal journey toward the sea. These were the sounds of home, of a life built on love and sustained by the courage to keep choosing each other every day. Margaret thought about her mother's wedding dress, now carefully stored in their bedroom wardrobe for some future daughter or daughter-in-law to wear. She thought about Thomas's portrait, which she'd finally moved to the attic, not out of anger or rejection, but out of a recognition that the past deserved to rest in peace while the living got on with the business of being alive. Most of all, she thought about the moment by the river when she'd found a giant of a man crying like a child, and how that moment of shared vulnerability had opened both their hearts to possibilities neither had dared to dream. Sometimes the greatest love stories began not with passion or romance, but with simple human kindness. Own person seeing another's pain and choosing to sit with it instead of walking away. As the moon climbed higher in the star-filled sky, Margaret Maddox no longer Waverley, but still herself in all the ways that mattered, closed her eyes and listened to her husband's heartbeat beneath her ear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to choose love over fear. But tonight, in the warm circle of his arms, she was exactly where she belonged. The strongest vows, she had learned, were not the ones spoken in churches before witnesses, but the ones whispered in the dark between two people who had seen each other's worst fears and chosen to stay anyway. They were the promises made not once but every day, in actions both large and small, in the decision to keep loving even when love required sacrifice. Outside their warm cabin, the prairie wind sang its ancient song of endurance and renewal. And inside, two hearts beat in rhythm, with the eternal promise that love, real love, was always worth the wait, always worth the fight, and always worth the risk of believing in second chances. The future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story, and Margaret could hardly wait to see what they would write together.